Hello, everyone. We are going to get started. Welcome, everybody. We are so glad to welcome you to the last event of the 2022 Conversations in Canadian Bioethics series. This series is hosted by the Canadian Bioethics Society and generously sponsored by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. A warm welcome to our CBS members, supporting organization, as well as to those of you who are not yet members, but we hope you will consider joining us to have further conversations like the one we will have today. There are a few ways you can join our conversation today. We are very pleased to have live simultaneous interpretation available for this session in both English and French. To hear everything in one particular language, please select that language from the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Also, closed captions are displayed as the speeches are delivered. We'll be holding a discussion period at the end of both presentations. However, you may enter a question at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You may enter your question in either French or English. Your name may be mentioned alongside your question. If you do not wish your name to be mentioned, please select the option to ask your question anonymously. You can also share your thoughts about this session and suggest topics for future sessions by filling out our survey, which we very much encourage you to do. The link will be posted in the chat. This session is being recorded and will be available on the CBS website at www.bioethics.ca. To further the goals of truth and reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the unceded and traditional lands of the Coast Salish Nations in Surrey, British Columbia. I encourage all of you to take a moment to acknowledge the land that you are on and the indigenous peoples, including the Métis, the Inuit, and other ancestors who have lived on and honored this land for centuries. By recognizing this history, we shine light on how our country was settled and, in the spirit of reconciliation, commit to addressing the injustices of the past and the systemic racism and oppression that continue against the indigenous First People of what is now called North America. About the CBS. The CBS is an interdisciplinary and interprofessional forum to discuss important topics in bioethics in Canada. My name is Moji Adurobangba. I am the Diversity Officer on the CBS board, and I'm also part of the subcommittee organizing this conversation series. The CBS landed the conversation series in April and continue opportunities for dialogue throughout the year, outside of our annual conference, and also to engage members or individuals who aren't yet members from diverse disciplines and backgrounds to enriching our conversations. This week is the National Health Ethics Week. We hope that in addition to joining this session today, you have ways to showcase the work of ethics in your different organizations. We have an upcoming workshop and community forum next year, May, and there will also be many student-specific events during that time. Please stay tuned. If this is the first time you're hearing of the CBS and you'd like to continue to be part of the conversations like the one we'll be having today, please consider joining us by going to our website. We do have both individual and institutional members, and support from our members allow us to continue to exist as a registered charity and non-profit society. I want to take this opportunity to thank our supporting organizations for their ongoing support. We have showcased our supporting organizations throughout this conversation series. And the supporting organization that we are highlighting at the beginning of our session today is the John Doster Health Ethics Center, University of Alberta. I will turn it over to Dr. Michael Van Manen to tell us a bit about their organization.
Thank you, Moji, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to introduce the John Doster Health Ethics Center. The Doster Center is located at the University of Alberta, standing on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Saulteaux, Niitsitapi, Métis, and Nakota Sioux. While the university is a welcoming place for people, we recognize that it exists as a settled place, erected on appropriated land. The Doster Center was founded in 1985 by the pioneering physician and bioethicist John Doster. As a member of the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta, Doster led a committee composed of individuals from nursing, medicine, chaplaincy, law, and philosophy to establish the center. To this day, the center remains rooted in interdisciplinarity, with members spanning clinical and academic appointments within the health sciences. Next slide. The mission of our center spans domains of interdisciplinary scholarship, clinical ethics, health policy consultation, and professional and public health ethics education. To promote ethical engagement, mutual respect, and critical reflection on matters of moral concern in healthcare. Since its beginning, the center has been inspired from discussions around challenging clinical cases. Next slide. Our center continues to support the clinical ethics services at the University of Alberta. We've been fortunate to have many members from clinical ethics as part of our center over the years. Next slide. In addition to supporting graduate students, our center supports the education of health science students and frontline staff within nursing, medicine, pharmacy, medical laboratory sciences, and other health science disciplines. Next slide. Through engagement activities like seminars, workshops, symposia, rounds, and other events, we aspire to support community spaces for discussion and reflection on past, contemporary, and anticipated health issues. We aim for all of our offerings to be accessible, such as our upcoming symposium on bodily autonomy. I put the QR link if you would love to join us. Next slide. Finally, our center supports collaborations in health ethics scholarship. Thank you again for providing me the opportunity to introduce our center. Please consider joining our mailing list and attending our upcoming events. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Michael. That was so great to learn about your organization. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our session today on bioethics and racism, Dr. Bashir Jiwani, who will in turn introduce the speakers. Dr. Jiwani is lead ethicist and executive director, ethics and diversity service at Fraser Health Authority, which serves one of Canada's largest, fast-growing, and most diverse regional populations. Bashir leads a team that provides decision support in patient care and at the system level builds capacity to deal with complex, ethically challenging situations in context of diversity, enables access to language resources, and build partnerships for understanding and collaborating with diverse communities. Bashir serves on various provincial, national, and international committees, boards, councils, and steering groups. Dr. Jiwani also currently serves as the president of the Canadian Bioethics Society. Kindly join me in welcoming Bashir.
Thank you so much, Moji. It's absolute great honor and pleasure to be able to moderate this session and to have a conversation with Anita and Zamina and the folks who are joining us today. So I'm just delighted. Like Moji, I'm coming to you from Burnaby, British Columbia today, and like Moji, I spend most of my time on the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish and the Intlakapam nations, home also to 6 Métis chartered communities. I actually came here about 50 years ago, a little bit more than that, with my family as a refugee, where I was a guest of the colonizing authorities at the time, and not a guest of the Indigenous peoples who have been living here for thousands of years before that. Just recognize and acknowledge that reality. So today, our topic is a very large topic with multiple entry points. And so I think we're really blessed to have Anita and Zamina provide us with a couple of ways of coming into the conversation. This is called a conversation series. So both Anita and Zamina are going to make contributions of about 15 minutes initially, but then we really are hoping this will become a conversation. We will invite the participants to share your thoughts, share your questions through the Q&A, and I will then take those and on your behalf guide a conversation after that. Our goal is to create a safe and respectful environment where we can challenge difficult issues together in a professional, constructive way. And so I'm really hoping that that's where we're going to go in our discussion. The growing sensitivity to diversity suggests the importance of recognizing our own situatedness. And so understanding who we are that are actually practically in these conversations and who are affected by these conversations. And so as we begin this conversation, I'd actually like to invite you to think about some what I think are important questions. Reflect on who's on the panel. What assumptions are you making about the perspectives that are going to be shared by the panelists? What other perspectives are important that we would also want to include in our conversation? How are each of us situated? What are the relevant diversity characteristics that comprise your identity? And as you think about that, how do those diversity characteristics impact the kind of privilege and power space you occupy and the vulnerability that you might occupy? And it's probably going to be very close and dynamic. And I invite you to think about this as we engage the ideas that Anita and Zamina will guide us. And with this subtle invitation to be uncomfortable, which I want to name is actually, now we all understand, I think, a hallmark of entering into these discussions is that we are entering into spaces that are going to make us uncomfortable, and we want to go in there willingly, hopefully with the trust that the environment will support us to be able to engage the things that we don't know that we're trying to figure out and that we're working through together. So with that, I'm going to now introduce Anita, our first speaker. So Dr. Anita Ho is a bioethicist and health services researcher with a unique combined academic training and experience in philosophy, clinical organizational ethics, public health, and business. Anita is currently Clinical Associate Professor at the Center for Applied Ethics at UBC, Associate Professor at the UCSF Bioethics Program, Scientist at the Center for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences, and Senior Director of Ethics, Northern California for Providence. She's also an elected Fellow of the Hastings Center. An international scholar and author of more than 70 publications, Anita's current research focuses on ethical dimensions of utilizing innovative and artificial intelligence technologies in healthcare, research and trial design ethics, supportive decision-making, and end-of-life decisions. She's particularly interested in systemic and social justice issues arising in healthcare. Her broader research interests include cross-cultural and global health ethics, organizational and system ethics in healthcare, trust and decision-making in clinical and research medicine, professional patient relationships, disability and pain experiences, and various concepts of autonomy. I hope to put the pauses in the right places in those areas. Her forthcoming book, Live Like Nobody Is Watching, Relational Autonomy in the Age of Artificial Intelligence Health Monitoring, is being published by Oxford University Press. Anita, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Bashir. and really is an honor to be part of this conversation today. May I share my screen now with you?
Please do.
Okay. Great. Hope you see my screen okay here.
We do.
Perfect. So again, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to CBS and the organizers for this opportunity to be part of this really important, even though, as Dr. Jiwani was saying, an enormous conversation. So the subtitle of my talk is really a bit of a wordplay on a short paper that I wrote a few years ago on whether those of us in the field of bioethics are part of the problem in perpetuating structural racism in medicine. So what I want to tackle today is to really think about how we can stop being part of the problem and instead be part of the solution. So I want to, before I start, I want to also acknowledge the lands that we are on. As a UBC faculty member, I respectfully acknowledge and I'm very grateful that much of my learning and working in the past 15 years have been taking place in Vancouver, which is on the traditional and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also want to express my gratitude that my learning and professional work continues in other parts of the world. And today I'm currently in Northern California on the ancestral land of the Coast Miwok, Pomo, and Wapo people. So as Dr. Jiwani said, bioethics and racism really is an enormous topic. And there is a diversity of experience and approaches to these issues. So this is really more of a conversation starter based on my own personal and professional experiences, rather than me pretending to solve all the problems in the next 15 minutes. And as my mother often would say, that she hopes that people don't think that I represent all Chinese people. Well, I lovingly think the same for her as well. So I certainly don't represent the perspectives of others who may have different experiences or backgrounds. So where am I coming from in approaching this really massive topic? Some of my identities are probably more visible or audible to you, whereas others may be more subtle and hidden. And I come to this topic as someone with various privileges and barriers that may or may not be visible to you. A first-generation college graduate, a cisgender female, an immigrant born and raised in a colony, Hong Kong, and then worked in 3 different countries that were not my native land, Canada, Singapore, and the United States. And when I started preparing for this talk, I realized that my personal experience of racism had actually kind of changed in different phases of my training and profession. So this is kind of dating myself a bit. In the 90s and in 2000s, I was asked actually quite regularly whether I was grateful for affirmative action, since the people who asked the question probably presumed that that's how I got into graduate schools or got employed. And after getting promoted and tenured in 3 different countries, people didn't really ask me that question, at least so explicitly anymore. But there are still other forms of microaggression that would continue to pop up here and there. A few years ago, I was giving a land acknowledgement at the beginning of a public presentation on a CIHR-funded study on supportive decision-making with diverse population. And a very seasoned bioethicist started interrupting me. Now, you might want to breathe a sigh of relief. This was not in Canada, and the person was unfamiliar with land acknowledgement. But they expressed dismay that my mentioning of these different territories really confused them about where my research was conducted. The person then continued to interrupt me throughout my presentation, and I wish I could say that this was the last episode of Put Downs. I did wonder, would the person have done the same if I weren't East Asian, an immigrant, or female? Now, I have no idea. I only sense that we got along much better when I was adhering to the stereotype of a model minority, staying relatively quiet, working really hard, and not appearing too keen or too ambitious in my research or career goals. But how should one actually respond to that or other experiences that may have some discriminatory undertones, especially when we are working in the field of bioethics? My presentation that I was alluding to was on diversity and how some populations feel mistreated in therapeutic encounters and in the healthcare system. So the irony was certainly not lost on me. But I was so shocked at that time that I just didn't know how to respond on the spot. And whether I had internalized the model minority identity or whether I simply thought that the professional response was to continue the presentation and pretend that nothing odd was happening, especially because I couldn't prove that the behavior was prompted by racism, or I didn't want other audience members to feel uncomfortable, I can't really say. But in that and in subsequent experiences, I felt that I was confronting all four intersecting dimensions of racism. There was the internalized racism, where I felt the need to adhere to the stereotypes and prejudices of racism and be the model minority to hopefully keep myself safe from blatant attacks. There was the obvious interpersonal dimension. I would brace myself in future encounters and wondered how I should respond to further microaggressive behaviors. And then there was the institutional dimension, where the institutional structure made it almost impossible for me, or perhaps even for others in the audience, to push back on such power play behavior. And then there was structural racism, whereby power hierarchy was created to designate superiority and privileges to some, and then to keep others in their place via stereotype and discriminatory attitudes, ones that I might have unfortunately internalized. Now, certainly, I do realize that I hold many, many other privileges. I'm highly educated, English-speaking, able-bodied, and more than fully employed. So I have various forms of security and advantages that others from the same ethnic background may or may not have. And just because racism exists doesn't mean that everyone who is a member of an ethnic or racialized group would have the same experience. Like what my mother was saying, I don't represent all Chinese people. We all have multiple identity factors, and our experiences are shaped by the interactions and intersections of all these different social identity factors. People like Kimberly Crenshaw had made it very clear that in addition to race, ethnicity, indigeneity, there are also other factors such as gender, class, sexuality, geography, age, disability, ability, migration status, or religion. So inequalities may not really result from the social devaluing of any one single identity factor in isolation, but they may intersect and form different parts of an individual's identity, power relations, and experience. So returning to bioethics, I want to ask whether we in bioethics are reproducing some of these intersecting biases and perpetuating trauma, even while we try to solve ethical dilemmas and address value conflicts at the bedside, at the bench side, or in boardrooms. We're generally hired by and operate within academic and healthcare systems that have long perpetuated racism and other forms of oppression. They could be against people with mental illness, addictions, disabilities, various gender identities, etc. Clinical ethicists also practice within the same culture and framework that are often insensitive to racial dynamics and historical injustice, rendering many of us susceptible to the same kind of dominance and normativity of whiteness of the cultural construction of Western bioethics. One time, a friend of mine sent me a hashtag, quote, bioethics so white. But I think that whiteness is not necessarily about the skin color of those who practice bioethics. Rather, it is first and foremost about the dominant cultural norms and ideologies that have come to structure how bioethics is being practiced, and what principles and contexts are considered relevant in our inquiries. So consider ethics consultations regarding Indigenous parents who may reject or at least question Western medicine for their children in favor of traditional medicine, or an immigrant family from the Philippines who insists on aggressive interventions for their loved ones at the end of life. These discussions generally start with a predetermined and decontextualized notion of the patient's best interest and the cautionary warning of the care team's ethical duty to protect the patient from misguided, irrational, or perhaps even overbearing families. While clinical interests are certainly of utmost importance in the therapeutic setting, care teams and even bioethicists who fail to engage with diverse moral ideas and contextual considerations may inadvertently exacerbate the conflict and power hierarchy at interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. So to prevent being part of the problem, I think we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions as we move forward. Through the methods and principles we use, sorry, just 1 second here. Sorry. Through the methods and principles we use to analyze clinical research and organizational ethics issues, we have to ask ourselves, are we reinforcing racism or other forms of power hierarchy? What are the ways in which we may have internalized some of the power structures when we work with different population groups? And how may we respond differently to patients or their families due to their racialized identities in our professional relationships? And our institutional and system practices that try to reduce variation sometimes inadvertently reinforce the dominance of some approaches over others. So I think that in order to dismantle racism in bioethics, we need to refocus on justice as a foundational principle. We need to look at different forms of justice, or even how we measure progress when various practices affect different populations differently. For example, we need to look at distributive justice, such as how research or healthcare resource allocation practices may benefit some groups more than others. We also need to consider justice as fairness and non-discrimination, including whether or how we are developing education and practice guidelines to correct our prejudice and to promote culturally safe care practices. We also need to think about epistemic justice in healthcare encounters, whereby we respect people who use different methodologies as equal knowledge creators and ensure equal access to information and digital infrastructure that can facilitate knowledge acquisition. And as Western bioethics has often focused on the 4 principles of respectful autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, I think that we also need to reinterpret other bioethical principles or balance the weight in bioethical analysis through the lens of justice. So for example, the concept of relational autonomy, which is one that I have used many times in analyzing issues in disability ethics and other forms of oppression in bioethics, may help us to look more closely at how to enhance respect for persons and communities by dismantling racial power asymmetries. So to truly address and counter racism or be anti-racist, I would like to critically evaluate how we conduct our research, teaching, and service activities as part of our commitment to racial justice. I think that the justice and anti-racist lens can help us to ask why we prioritize certain bioethical topics over others. For example, as we give more and more attention to genomic, big data, and AI ethics, which are worthy topics, and I have been writing on this as well, we need to ask more fundamental questions of whether these are even the most pressing concerns for racialized groups that are still struggling for access to basic and culturally safe care. And as I address in my upcoming book, some of these technologies may actually further reduce people's access to in-person and culturally appropriate care, or they may actually be trusted less by care providers if their testimonies are not being accompanied by these technological outputs. So such a justice lens can also help us to reflect on which stakeholders are or should be involved in setting the agenda of deciding and funding these priorities, and what processes are used in making these determinations or addressing disagreements. It may also help us to radically reimagine power hierarchy and power sharing in not only clinical and research medicine, but also in bioethics, such as how ethics consultations are done, who are involved in care conferences, etc. So certainly, I think that a lot of work still needs to be done, and it requires that we have an inclusive space and safe space for these important discussions, where people of all backgrounds, especially those who have been racialized and historically disadvantaged, feel safe to have these conversations. But at the same time, I also think that we need to recognize the potential concerns of sometimes essentializing and segregating people based on differences. especially given the intersectionality of people's different social identities and experiences. A couple of years ago, I was asked to lead or join a diversity support group, and we were given a list that you see on your right here. These categories were preset, and when the one that I was invited to choose, in the end, didn't have enough, quote, interest, I was asked to join another group. But by that time, I actually didn't know which of the other groups I would belong to or was expected to join, given how these groups were named or set up. So I think that while having specific support resources for people with shared historical and ongoing experiences are very helpful, we also need to build allyship with people from different social locations and privileges. And after all, we all share accountability and responsibility, and everyone's involvement will be key in our progress towards an anti-racist field of bioethics and healthcare system. And in closing, and on the day of midterm election in the United States, I do remain hopeful in our joint quest to address racism and bioethics. While the topic is enormous and may seem daunting at first sight, as I mentioned earlier, racism has different dimensions. So depending on our social locations, we can all at least tackle one or more of the dimensions. And to be anti-racist in bioethics, we need to question how various forms of prejudice and bias live within us and within our field, from clinical to research to system ethics. And to hear more examples of how this may manifest, I'm now going to turn this back to Dr. Jiwani and to Zamina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ho. That was terrific, and I can't wait to get into the questions. I've got lots of things already, and there's some interesting questions emerging in the chat as well. So thank you for making us uncomfortable in a gentle and, it was for me, an edifying way. And now I will invite the same, extend the same invitation to Zamina to continue to make us a little bit uncomfortable in slightly different ways. And so it's my great pleasure then to introduce Zamina Mithani. And Zamina, please do turn your video on. Terrific. So Zamina is a medical student, an MD candidate, a bioethicist and writer, born and living on unceded Coast Salish territories here in Vancouver, BC. Prior to beginning her MD training at the University of British Columbia, she completed her Master's of Bioethics at Harvard Medical School in Boston. At UBC, she's a Westbrook Scholar and a Terry Fox Humanitarian Award winner, granted for her work on diversity and mental health. At Harvard, her work focused on the ethics of substance use care, trauma-informed care, end-of-life decisions, and anti-racism advocacy in medicine. She's given workshops and lectures on the value of ethics and narrative medicine to physicians, nurses, and ethicists across the US and Canada. And if you haven't checked out her TED Talk, I highly recommend you do that. It's an excellent way to spend a few minutes of your time. So Zamina, thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jiwani, for having me. I'm just going to share my slides really quickly. And thank you, Anita, for that fantastic introduction. I'm so grateful to have heard that, and sort of, I think it really places what I wanted to talk about today, which is to add on to it, but also to look at sort of bioethics and racism in a way that we can hopefully spark more discussion on how to move forward with this topic. So as a bit of an introduction, again, like Dr. Jiwani said, I'm a medical student and previously did my Master's of Bioethics. And I sort of accidentally became interested in the intersection of like racism and bioethics really at the time of COVID, when myself and my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Wes Boyd and Jane Cooper, who is on this call today, when we were just appalled at at what happened with George Floyd and what was going on in both the US and Canada in terms of how COVID had exacerbated disparities in healthcare, and how the pandemic had really just exacerbated what we already knew was this existing problem of racism and disparity. And we wrote on this sort of in that initial phase, and it really has prompted me, I think, in writing that. I've been doing less writing in my life and a lot more listening and observing. I'm in scrubs right now, and so currently calling you from a call room, and that has been powerful for me in a way of using the last few years rather to do a lot of listening and observing and seeing racism in the healthcare system today, and in many of my shifts, and sort of the ever presence of it and how it relates to bioethical issues. And so I'm so glad we're still having these discussions on what it means to be an anti-racist in the bioethics space, because I think while we've been having those discussions in so many amazing workshops, so many amazing issues and articles and conferences I know have featured this as their topic, I still think there's a lot of work to be done, and it's always important to keep talking about it as something that is an ongoing process of learning and humility for us. And so today I really wanted to build my talk around 3 big ideas, and I hope that these can also be conversation starters. So I want to look at, where are we now? It's 2022, almost 2023. I mean, Christmas decorations are already up, so basically almost 2023. And we're really, I think hitting the ground with an understanding and a collective consciousness that this is a problem, that this is something that we need to talk about more. And there are 3 things that I really want to highlight as ways that we can sort of summarize and ways that I think about anti-racism and bioethics now in this sort of post-COVID era that we're transitioning into. And they're, number 1, subtlety. So I want to talk about the subtlety of how racism can still be embedded in healthcare systems and bioethics. Subjected, so subjectivity, power, what it means to have power. And number 3, sustainability. If this is a movement, if this is a moment, how can we make this now permanent? How can we move from saying that people are marginalized to focusing on their strengths and focusing on the future of equity-seeking communities as doing that, the verb seeking? And so that's really what I want to focus on today. So number 1, I want to focus on the idea of subtlety. So I think, it is a really hard thing to talk about, because it's, again, like Dr. Ho has said, it is so hard to pinpoint those, and I totally, I think, respect and honor that story where it's something that I think is echoed in many, many persons of color and equity-seeking communities, those feelings of being uncomfortable, like a gut reaction, something where you feel like this isn't right, something isn't in its place. And actually, that's the word I love to use to describe injustice. It comes from an Arabic word to mean to not put something in its place. That feeling of misplacement. And when we talk about even land and we do the land acknowledgements of where we are, the feelings of place and where we place ourselves in a situation, but where we place ourselves in the meta narrative of who we are and where we are is incredibly important to how we discuss racism and bioethics. And I think here, sometimes we don't emphasize the importance of language enough, and how the small things that people say that make you feel a certain way can cause that sensation of misplacedness. And to pick that up as bioethicists is incredibly important in our work, because then we can do the work of leadership and recentering voices that are misplaced. And I'm on call right now, and I just wanted to give you a really quick example of actually something that happened to me today and yesterday. And it was it was tough because the languages are there. So there was this patient who came in with very severe pain, very severe sort of gastric pain. And she was Black and she was female, she, her pronouns. And it was really tough. In talking about her experience later, she was dismissed multiple times in the course of a couple of days as her pain not being as severe as she stated, not being where she stated, as being something else. And when the medications weren't working, her concerns were dismissed and, told to just give it some more time. And, she recalls being called a difficult patient in the past and someone who was non-compliant, who didn't show up to appointments on time. And those words sort of stood out to me when she was eventually diagnosed yesterday with an emergency and operated on. That's the only time she felt finally somebody understood my pain. And it was really heartbreaking to hear that story, and especially the kinds of words that were used to describe her narrative and the words that surround sort of things that are people who feel marginalized as difficult or non-compliant. Those words, while they're so common in our jargon sometimes to describe, a clinical situation, can really have a traumatizing impact on people in the actual state. And I feel like this iatrogenic trauma, sometimes this trauma that we cause with our own language and our own ways of categorizing people, is sometimes a misuse of power in the most subtle ways, in the ways that maybe you feel like, oh my God, am I being difficult? Or am I being, am I the problem? When in reality, it's the system. And so, I wanted to share this story as just something that happened to me yesterday that really had me thinking and preparing for this talk, that sometimes it is the language we use. It is the fact that we still call certain communities marginalized. I mean, yes, there are, different socioeconomic barriers that different communities face, but there are also ways of framing them in terms of their strengths, in terms of their multiple identities, in terms of the power and the beauty that they bring to our society, healthcare system, and bioethical world. And so being cognizant of how we frame, people, not only in the negativistic light, but also in the forward-seeking light, can help us think about ways that now we can take this awareness that we have about racism being a problem. And I want to make a blanket statement and assume that everyone on this call is on board with that as being the thesis that we do have a problem. And now look in a forward, sort of a more forward-thinking way in how we can really work to fix this and work together to this. There are so many more examples of, what this can look like. But when I say that, sort of the word that I always use is misplacement. That's sort of where I look for in terms of subtlety, is something being misplaced. Listening and focusing, I think, on, communities in their own personal expressions of strength, be it through art, be it through their narratives, be it through, their traditions, and paying attention to that, I think, is a way that we can pick up when things are misplaced. The second word I really want to focus on is subjected. And I think this is going back to the idea of power and who holds post-pandemic, or whatever we call this era, power in the realm of how we aim to switch that, as Dr. Ho said very, very eloquently. And, in our paper, we talked about power relations, according to Foucault, being mobile, reversible, and unstable. That power is not just something in a hierarchy, but it's something that on a daily basis we give and take, such that I hold certain powers in certain points of my life, my day, in the certain identities that I have that are very different than other people. As Dr. Ho stated, there's that intersectionality, but that intersectionality can also have those caveats of power given within those different identities that we have privilege within the areas of non-privilege. And those things aren't binary. They're not that there is this one category of the all-powerful and one category of the not. Power is constantly being balanced. And I think as bioethicists, we're in this unique position of being the negotiators, obviously, in many situations of power, be they clinical situations or research situations or policymaking situations. There's so many ways that we have to negotiate multiple interests. And so by understanding who wields power when and what kind of power we have to sort of make an ethical framework, propose an idea, to categorize things, that very act of categorization is an act of asserting power. And I really want to emphasize that I think that's the way we need to reframe this idea of who has power and who doesn't, because then it puts a lot more responsibility on us, and it makes us feel a lot more uncomfortable with the fact that on a daily basis, the language we use, the ways that we are, subtly, choosing to hear certain things about a story or choosing not to, that in itself yields power. And, my experience is, I might look a certain way that's very different. I might, but I still have certain things that make me different than the next person who looks the way I do. And so that's just sort of what it means to honor the fact that, equity-seeking communities are not monoliths. They are not homogenized, groups of people. I'd argue the same is true in Canada for some of the big marginalized populations that we talk about, namely the Indigenous folks. in that, young Indigenous people who are in urban versus rural communities, folks who have queer or different identities on top of Indigenous identities, have very different experiences and stories. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that we might not be able to read everyone's story. That would be a textbook that would take eons to finish. But I think it's something that we have to keep trying to do, to acknowledge that if we don't know someone's story, we can't just assume that just because on their EMR it says, something, that doesn't mean that's the beginning sentence to their chapter. We really have to be more cognizant of the power we yield, and of the fact that homogenizing and categorizing is a way to exert power. And I think we even saw this, in COVID and with policies. And it's a way that we can move forward in terms of asking ourselves, in future pandemics, in future current epidemics, or, big global problems like climate change, like food insecurity, like migrational issues, how can we create, instead of retrospective policies, prospective policies that look at these issues, enable us to sort of create those, collective communities where we can hear different stories and different sides of an issue and assess what these could look like in the future before having to act upon them reactionarily. And I think that's one of the big problems we faced in COVID, is that we thought of racism post hoc. We didn't realize this was going to be at the forefront of what it means to have different and current outcomes. I mean, current research on long COVID sort of mirrors the kind of equity barriers and discrepancies that we saw of people who are affected, and how people of color might have different baseline chronic conditions based on geography, socioeconomic status, and opportunity that now have exacerbated the effects that they will receive in years to come when it comes to something like long COVID, as an example of a way that we can't just experience racism and bioethics as a moment, but it really should transform us. I think that comes to my last point, is on sustainability. So how can we make this idea of bioethics and racism something that is sustainable? I think number one, what we have to do is we have to realize that this isn't just a moment. The idea of bioethics and racism is, very catchy. It's very, it's on articles, it's on conferences. It's something that we want to talk about. But my fear is that if we make it a moment, we relegate it in a certain time and space of our bioethics era that we don't get back. We don't get that momentum back. And there's a really great word for this, again, in the Sufi mythology and philosophy, called hal. And hal is basically, I love this word because it means a spark. It's kind of like the spark, that initial gut reaction, like I talked about in the beginning of this presentation, like a gut feeling like something's not right. A hal is also a gut feeling that something needs to be done. So it's like a perspective gut feeling that there's something that needs to be fixed here. And having that gut feeling, according to this philosophy and the word itself, it can be temporary, but it can also be flamed, akin to how sparks of a fire can be flamed to create more embers and create a movement. And I think in that way, I really view bioethics in the same way. And my fear is that if it becomes this moment, and this can be part of the conversation we have, hopefully, how do we not make it this moment? But if it sort of keeps to this moment, my fear is that we will lose the wonderful momentum we have to really ask ourselves, how do we move beyond talking about who's marginalized and who's not, and create a world where now we're not looking at we're not looking at ways to include, but we've done it, and we're looking at ways to improve and integrate and enhance that inclusion. And so I think that looks like, to me, one of the goals that we are still working towards, and I think making really good strides towards, but can obviously do more. And that way, data, research, all of that is incredibly important. Writing, and I think also art is one of the really important things. And I want to emphasize art as one of the ways to create this forward building competency because I think that as bioethicists, sometimes, maybe I'll only speak for myself, but sometimes we get bogged down in the principles and in the semantics and in the data and in the information, that we don't sometimes acknowledge that there is a very emotion and affective component to the problems we face and the way that those problems make us feel. And acknowledging that and acknowledging the biases that come with that, the gut reaction and how that frames how we think about issues is incredibly important. If something makes us feel a certain way, and if we practice feeling those ways through engaging with art created by different equity-seeking communities, then I think we can truly bring ourselves to a place where we're more emotionally intelligent as bioethics to really take those gut reactions, assess if they have biases, but also honor the fact that a lot of the work of equity is done when we feel the pain of others, and building that is incredibly important, and I think can be done through art. And I will share a poem to end this discussion to really emphasize that. But at the same time, Angela Davis has a wonderful quote, and she says, quote, "The relegation of race to matters of the heart makes it extremely difficult to identify the deep structural entrenchment of contemporary racism." And I think that's also important. We can't just keep it to the feelings and the temporary spark of feeling that empathy. It needs to translate into problem solving. It needs to translate into perspective, ways that we create policies around new issues and old issues like climate change, migration, etc., and all the things that we have in our everyday lives. So when we think about pain, for example, and the story that I had a couple of days ago, or when we think about what does it mean to have certain categories in our EMRs, or have certain boxes that label people a certain way, or even in our sort of research ethics formulations, what does that mean to label? And we need to often do it in order to create the policies and structures, but having a very metacognitive awareness of what we're doing is incredibly important, I think, to the whole process of moving forward. Because I think we've had so many workshops and discussions like this as a bioethics community. And my hope is that we can move towards, talking about the marginalized as the victim, and only in this very negative light that, oh, we need to do something, etc., and move towards also strength and capacity building. What has been done? And look at this, look at this, and look at the strength here, and look at this improvement here. So I think the balance of both is incredibly important in that process. And so I want to wrap up here with a poem, and the poem is just again to add a little fuel for thought and to emphasize the importance of moving forward in a way that embodies lived experience and narratives. So this is part of a 10-chapter poem by Patricia Smith. And again, the feeling here is the feeling of being washed away. And I hope this is not something we do with our discussions on racism and bioethics. So, dear someone who woke up without a sun, dear damn the dawning echoes of a knock with no boy crouched behind it, nothing done to fix it. Dear reverberating shock, dear someone flailing, ripping at the air, dear hollow where he was, dear someone who's obsessed with resurrecting him, who dares believe the muck of bullet hole and bruise will ever breathe as anything but dead. Dear someone loving body on its way to being only body, just that red and syrupy annoyance, hosed away when street decorum says it will. Dear damn, dear chalk all washed to none, dear traffic jam. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Zamina. That again was fantastic, and look forward to probing. And I'll invite Anita to join us again as well. And I want to thank both of you for offering very concise ways of making sense of these ideas, and also for speaking both to the intellectual dimension of the experience of inequity and discrimination and ethics, and the bodily experience as well. So let's get into some of the questions. We have about a half an hour for this, so I'm looking forward to engaging, and I'll invite again the participants watching the webinar to please do share your thoughts, your questions, so we can share them, and we'll do our best to be concise in the way that we engage them, so we can get through as many ideas as possible. I'll start with the first question that's already come up, and it goes back to the relationship of bioethics and bioethicists, and in a sense, supporting the power infrastructures that are already in place. And so, Anita, you talked about the idea, you pointed to the link between, and I'm reading the question here, between bioethics and supporting the way in which medicine upholds oppressive power dynamics, especially ableism, healthism, and anti-fat prejudice. And wondering if you could explore or say more about the obligations of bioethicists in working with our healthcare provider colleagues to respond to this. And if I may just say a couple of quick things as you think about your response, Anita. To start, I'm not going to read the names of the people that are asking the questions. This is going to be posted online afterwards, so just to maintain that anonymity. I'm also going to sort of point to a couple of other things in the question as well. So, for example, Anita, you talked about the relationship between bioethics and other and medicine, and the oppressive nature that medicine can reinforce as well. You also talked about the latent oppression in some of the methods and principles that we use in bioethics, and we may need to think about some of that. And Zamina, you talked about the power of language and how very subtly in the language we use we can be doing this as well. So I'll invite Zamina for you to comment on this as well. But I mean, if I may ask you to first offer your reflections, what are obligations of bioethicists in this context?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for that question as well. And some of you may know this, and I was doing quite a bit of work in clinical ethics, and then I decided to go back to school to study public health. And I think part of the reason why I did that was because I really felt like in bioethics, we may need to have much more of a public health lens in thinking about our obligations. And I think Zamina has certainly pointed out a lot of the structural issues that we are dealing with during and currently even after COVID as well. And so I think that there may be questions in terms of how do we work with our colleagues in thinking about the social determinants of health, rather than thinking about various issues as simply individual quote unquote responsibilities and so on. And I think that in many ways we have to think about this also from even a pragmatic perspective. How do we actually even engage patients? How do we even strengthen our therapeutic relationships with them? So if patients feel that they're being discriminated against for whatever reasons it might be, whether because we have various kinds of isms, towards people because of their ability, mobility, their body size, religion, and so on and so forth, they simply would not be able to engage with us because they don't see that we understand the context within which that they live, that they engage in various kinds of health activities. So I think that is one of the important parts is really to think more about the social determinants of health and how that actually frame people's experiences to start with. This perhaps also is important in, I mentioned the notion of epistemic justice. How do we actually really center back on what the patient's own reality might be? They are the ones who are the experts in their own experiences, their lived experiences. And so we focusing on that may help us at least to really recognize, some more humility in our parts as well. We may often be the experts in thinking about the clinical factors, but the clinical aspects often are very small aspects in terms of how patients actually experience their life, experience their, the day-to-day priorities. So I think having that would at least be a good starting point for us. I'll pause there for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anita. And I'll invite Zamina, you to comment as well. And I'll just offer a couple of reframes in addition to what Anita's saying, because so one of the things is, so Zamina, you pointed out the fact that you're also spending more time reading and less time writing. And it reminds me of when we're talking about this idea of humility, of sort of the indigenous wisdom that, we have 2 eyes and 2 ears, lots of tools for perceiving, and 1 mouth. And maybe we should take some direction from that. And so, Zamina, I'm curious to know how do you think about this?
Yeah, I really respect the idea of two-eyed seeing, and I think it's been really transformative. Sometimes, this might be a bit controversial to say, but sometimes I think in any profession, we are often focused on outputs, because outputs build professional acumen, citation lists, publications, career, and power in those ways which are important, and less on inputs. And I think it is also a privilege to be able to step back and focus on inputs. And I can do that as a learner because I'm given a bit of a hard pass of, okay, like maybe you don't have time to do as much outputting. And that's very true. But I think the balance of both input and output in the work of bioethics is incredibly important. Because if we're always focused on sort of, and it can be not even in a publication sense, it can also just be in a way of, talking and communicating, that if we don't actually do the work of listening and don't actually embed ourselves in these communities, then again, we're talking from this ivory tower of power where like we think in the ways that other people have written, in the ways that like academia or other colleagues have posited certain groups or certain issues, but not actually by being part of their ceremonies or part of their ways of being, or at the bedside talking to them in a way that doesn't make them feel like, oh, I'm talking to you as someone who's marginalized, but just talking to them in a way that, exudes kindness and compassion. And, for the person on pelvic pain or gastric pain that I talked about earlier, the way I found out about her stories, I realized we support different football teams in the English Premier League. So she's a Tottenham fan and I'm Man United. And that's how we had our conversation, but something just very human like that to enable us to sort of be in the communities and represent the communities. I had a really great mentor tell me that I think bioethics and medicine isn't complete until the people on the table or the people leading our structures represent the people we serve. And until our bodies look like the people we're serving, our work isn't complete.
Thank you for that. We're getting more questions. I want to come back to you, Anita, for just a moment. And again, building on the same idea, you talked about the importance of paying attention to the social determinants of health and moving justice beyond sort of the narrow distributive model located in hospital, usually, to a broader social justice, public health kind of approach. And I'm curious to know, practically, what would that look like? Zamina pointed a little bit to the conversation we might have in the case she presented, but like, practically, what would it look like for us to listen better with a broader lens, paying attention to these dynamics in the case of that kind of patient that, again, Zamina pointed to?
If I may actually use another patient example there, it's one of the clinical ethics cases that really, I don't know if haunted is the right word, but we had one time there was a patient situation that the patient had experienced chronic unstable housing situations and was brought in, and the patient apparently was, according to the healthcare team, being, quote, non-compliant. Again, language problem there, right? But the patient was keep pulling tubes out and so on and so forth. And the care team asked for an ethics consult, and the care team said that, we have a patient who is, quote, non-compliant, but I think that the patient basically does not want care. And if we want to, quote, respect the person's autonomy, we need to really stop the interventions because the patient is not consenting. So when the patient talked more, and the patient actually did say one thing to say that, well, what's the point of me, getting all these anyway? Because you're just sending me back to the street and there's no hope. So I might just let me die, because otherwise, what's the hope? And somehow the conversation initially just stopped right there, thinking that this is about respectful autonomy. This is a patient who thinks that further care or further intervention is no longer helpful. But I think that if we actually think more from a social determinants of health perspective, in terms of how we think about hopelessness or kindness that Zamina was also talking about, that could really help us to reframe what exactly might the patient need at that point. there is the clinical care, but that's not the biggest concern for the patient at that moment. It's really actually beyond the hospital care. So hospitals often do have various kinds of resources to connect patients with community services. Are we starting with some of those discussions? If we do, we perhaps even restructure our healthcare funding or the way that we think about healthcare. It's not just how a hospital is being funded. That may be another way for us to really think through some of these issues. But at least in smaller scale, what can bioethicists do and what can hospital staff do is to really think about what are some of the community partners that we can also have as our resources in connecting patients to care outside of the hospital.
Thanks, Anita. It makes me think of the fact that in bioethics, we love, or even in healthcare, we love to talk about interventions. And should we do this intervention or that intervention? And really, we need to broaden the conversation to what are the goals of care? And that's going to mean looking at a much broader picture than maybe just what's going on in the intervention. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And Zamina, I'd like to ask you this other question. We've got another question about culture that's going to come up in a moment that I'm excited about as well. But sorry, the question I want to ask you, Zamina, that was posed to the group is, how can senior leaders be more inclusive of young leaders and students who are both passionate about this work and have their own lived experiences that could inform this work? Like so many cases, it's where the youth is going to be really where change comes from. So how do we actually create space for that? Yeah, what's your sense of that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I think it just starts by doing, like really, like it's the small things that are really helpful, like having places where young folks can write, like places where young learners or young bioethicists can get together and discuss. I think places that also honor like the learner experience as a place of both disadvantage and privilege. Like I have disadvantages in the way that I can't do all of the interventions, et cetera, have the power to sort of prescribe or order, et cetera. But advantages in the way that I'm able to sit with patients longer. And sometimes they open up to me because they have a bit more time to sit with them and ask more questions. And so there's always that double-edged sort of sword of, when, again, thinking of power, someone is in like in an emerging career position, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have, they lack certain experiences, absolutely, but they also come with their own experiences. So I think making that balance between the two and, including folks within committees. I think having a medical learner on a bioethics committee is often a really great idea, or some kind of learner, in order just to create also that continuity and legacy for what bioethics training can look like and inform that sort of decision-making sort of process as it goes on. I found that some of my most powerful experiences in thinking about bioethical issues is when I've been able to observe committees at work. It has caused me to think of how I think of certain things and challenge those assumptions. And I've also been able to get other folks thinking of ways that I approach a certain problem. And so inclusion is always important there.
And if I may, Anita, I invite you to answer the question as well, but I'd like to add another wrinkle to it from another question we've received. It's about our instrumental practices and our structure. So the question is that, in our agendas and the way that we address each other, we often refer to someone as Dr. So-and-so, that they're a medical doctor. Sometimes we extend that to folks who have PhDs, but not always. And then there are others who don't have any kind of prefix that we add to their name. And so I'm curious to know what you think about this idea of the subtle power dynamics that influence the way that just our culture, the way we work together. And again, maybe if you have any thoughts connecting that to what the earlier question about the role of students and other perspectives as well. What's your sense of this?
Well, and in terms of students and learners, they are the ones who are going to be carrying the baton as well, right? And so I often think that those are the perspectives, the fresh perspectives that will really help us to think about, how the way that things have been don't have to be the way that they will continue to be, right? So I think that if we have a sense of humility and that we are all learning together, then I think that having learners of any kind, right? I'm still a learner. Any kind would be a very valuable perspective. And especially because I think that this may also tie to helping, learners to be able to also let decision makers know that there may be certain types of training that we are lacking, right? Bioethics, I think there may be a question about bioethicists may not all have the training in terms of social determinants of health unless they are built into our curriculum. So learners can often offer that particular perspective as well. And learners often are the ones who are spending more times with the patients right now. So medical students are often the ones, maybe because they're not as jaded yet, that they spend more time with patients and families. So I think that perspective is certainly very important in different kinds of ways. In terms of addressing people, I think that's a fascinating question. I have had colleagues who said that they actually do want doctors being addressed as doctors in terms of physicians, partly because in hospitals, now I'm in both Canada and US, that there are different kinds of, licensing requirements in terms of who can answer what questions, who can fill out what forms. And so that may be important. But as we think about more inclusive, inclusionary practices, there are certainly questions in terms of how might that dynamic affect the way that people behave. And actually, I think that even there are times when the term doctor is being used, some people are also being referred to more as with their first name, even if they may be an MD or have a doctor. And so there may be other questions. This goes back to the intersecting, perhaps discrimination as well. So there may be also this other layer that we need to address. I do think that especially when we have more and more committees or other kinds of settings where we do want to be broadening the representation, that we do have to ask the question in terms of what are the purposes of the titles being used. I think sometimes they may actually be very legitimate and important to distinguish what professional roles that some people can carry out and not carry out, but at the same time that there certainly are situations, many situations where that may reinforce power more than anything else. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I want to come back again. I'm going to switch gears for a moment and come to you again, Zamina. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, you talked about the importance of art and culture as a way of thinking about issues of equity. And I'm curious to know here, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. I think that we talked about the sort of the bodily manifestation of our experiences every day and then the intellectual. And where would you like to see this go? Like, how would you see this happen? You talked about the importance of specifically attending to the art and culture of groups or individuals who have been victims of discrimination or racialized groups, for example. I think that's what I heard you say. And so is that where it's limited to, or is there another role for art and culture, role of beauty in trying to make sense of how we ought to live our lives? What's your sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think art plays so many important roles in medicine and bioethics. And I know it's always been sort of embedded, I think, within the culture of bioethics in ways that people are sort of exploring narrative or personal stories, even the idea of like the case study as the way that frames a subsequent framework comes from an idea of a story, and storytelling can take multiple forms. And so I think that is embedded within bioethics as a field and ought to be, I think, enhanced and emphasized when it comes to art being a way that we can sort of achieve the goal of creating humility and empathy and doing the work of listening and increasing our inputs rather than our outputs. And so, or alongside the output of bioethics. And so it's one of those ways that sort of it's low risk in the way that, you can consume art, let it consume you, and build that sort of inner competency of how do you engage with something that moves you in an emotional way, and how can that inform the way that you have an increased sensitivity towards certain patients, or balance your own biases or assumptions, or if a story makes you change your opinion about something, which I am sure most of the people on this call have probably read a book or seen a piece of artwork or listened to a piece of music that has moved them in a certain way. And so allowing ourselves, I think, to always be in tune with that as a skill and something that, folks can take home with them as a way to continue building an appreciation for the marginalized and to no longer marginalize them. Because if we sort of create that as if we take their counter narratives, if we take their art forms as part of our own and in the ways of consuming them regularly and not just keeping it in this, special box of, oh, okay, that's for them only, and engaging in those communities, engaging in different practices, I think it humbles us to also let those communities know, we're here with you and we want to know more and we want to be engaged in, poetry or whatever moves you most. So I think it's one of those things, for me at least, that's a way or a first step in addition to reading and, building our intellectual competencies around this issue, is building our emotional competencies around this issue as well. Because I think a lot of experiences around racism are not always verbalized in ways that are eloquent or academic, not always published in ways that are available to a bioethics audience. And it's those unpublished forms which I really try and actively seek in my own life.
That's beautiful. And it makes me think a little bit about a slightly different way of thinking about the epistemic injustice or justice idea that Anita pointed out, that our own rational methods tend to reduce people. We're looking for very basic understandings of people's beliefs and their values, but sometimes that can't be captured in simple words, especially if they come from traditions that are not Western. And so sometimes paying attention to poetry or symbolic language, but also other kinds of art, can help us to have a better understanding of someone's value system in a way that the kind of, what's important to them about whether they get, antibiotics or not, just wouldn't capture for us. So interesting. Again, I'm going to switch gears, and I'm really grateful for all the different kinds of questions we're getting in the Q&A. One of the things that I think we're recognizing, and I'll be transparent here and say this is, I think, a bit of a concern for our society as well, is that we sometimes focus our approach on questions of clinical ethics that take place in the hospital, as opposed to the much broader areas that bioethics encompasses. And so one of the questions we have actually is about research ethics and the advice that we might have for research ethics boards as they think about balancing the needs of racialized patients and researchers, recognizing the enormous power dynamics between patients and clinician researchers, and how we might be able to support that. The comment is, I think we need to recognize that power differences between patients who are ill and the clinicians responsible for their care will always exist regardless of racialized identification of the patient. So if that's true, then what does that mean for how maybe research ethics boards might look at their work? And Anita, may I invite your thoughts on this?
Sure. So there may be different layers to that question. So let me maybe tackle something I think a bit more, foundational as well. In terms of how do we actually involve patients in research, and especially if they may be coming for more the racial, if they have been racialized and so on and so forth. I mentioned in my presentation earlier that maybe even the first question that we have to ask to whether sometimes in bioethics and perhaps in clinical research too, that we are conducting research or being engaged in various kinds of inquiries that are specifically important to the priorities of those who we are serving. So one question that we may want to ask, and for populations that have been historically more racialized and marginalized, is whether what we are trying to study actually really are engaging those who are in the communities who are most affected. Is that really their priorities? Have they actually been consulted or engaged in setting the agenda for that research project? And so if we are studying certain types of conditions that may be affecting that particular population more, that may be, of course, a noble reason to do that. But we have to answer, I think, even then further questions. And so especially for clinician researchers, to ask the question in terms of, are there resources after we have studied these conditions for these populations that will be tailoring for these populations so that they can seek care? So I think that sometimes we may be studying various kinds of conditions in different communities without recognizing that actually some of these communities may not be able to access the drugs or the interventions that we might think would be helpful for the populations. So there is, I think that the intersecting considerations there from an ethical perspective, that when we are doing research, the impact is not just to study whether something is being effective for various populations. The question we have to answer is also what would we be able to do about that afterwards to ensure access, equitable access as well.
Thank you so much. And thank you for both of you for willing to kind of jump from question to question, topic to topic again. It's such a big area as we've talked about, and so you're doing a fabulous job. Really grateful. Zamina, I want to ask you another question that came up in the chat, and that's about the reality of healthcare today and the constraints that our healthcare providers are working with. And so we know that we have shortages of healthcare workers, enormous pressure on operations and the delivery of healthcare services to folks. And so in a way, the question is, how do we still pay attention to this really, really important work? But in a context where our own energy, our own hearts are expended and spent in very different kinds of ways. So maybe a simple way to ask this question is, you're already overworked, you're already super stressed, you have to focus on getting things done. There aren't enough people to help you to do all that stuff. And now we're saying to people, you really need to keep in mind just how situated you are, pay attention to embedded hierarchies, implicit biases, systemic injustices, and you need to add that to that work. How do you think about that? What do you think about that?
It's a tough question because people of color often don't get a choice. We don't have to say that, oh, now we have to make some time out to think about this. We are embedded in like the systems of violence and discrimination right off the bat. Every day I have to, decide if I'm going to let something really affect my mood and affect my performance, something that a patient or a colleague says to me, which even as a learner has happened multiple times, or do I, move on and do the work? That's not a choice that many people of color get, to be able to say, oh, we're burnt out and now we have to also think about racism. Oh no. I think it's a lived experience that people of color live and, marginalized communities to different degrees, people with disabilities, folks in the LGBTQ+ community, like everyone experiences that in different varying ways, but it's not necessarily a choice that we can choose not to experience it, because it's part of our identity. And so I would urge anyone who says that, they're, the way that they, and I respect that, it's a lot of work and there's a lot of things involved, but I think I think the first thing is just to build like a consciousness that this is here, this has always been here. Maybe it hasn't always been here for me, but this has always been here for my patients. And building that consciousness, I hope, wouldn't require an enormous amount of textbook reading and exam taking. And I think that is the first step. And then I think in, doing the bare minimum of acknowledging in any patient situation, is there a way that I've dismissed someone in a way that is more convenient for me and isn't necessarily true to what they've done? If I'm taking an informed consent, have I really made it informed, or am I just, sort of not really wanting to put the extra time in to get an interpreter and feel like I can just sort of get by and then move on to my next paperwork so I can fill out my billings in time? Like, I think there are ways that we can really critically assess what we put in us and what we put out us in a way that acknowledges that, hey, listen, like, this is maybe not something I'm experiencing every day in its most violent forms, but that other people are. And that, the most important thing I think to recognize, especially in a healthcare setting, because maybe it's the only one I can speak to right now, is that sometimes people don't realize that they're in the position of being, at a disadvantage in some ways. And maybe you're the only person who can realize it because you have the point of comparison to how other people are treated. That in itself is a power that they might not necessarily say, oh, hey, that's not fair. I think I'd rather have an interpreter so I can explore why I don't want a C-section. They might just say, okay, I trust you. You're the doctor, you do what you want, and, have that And I think it's your responsibility to make sure that, they, and, that you advocate for them. And that's just basic advocacy and social justice, but you don't even have to put it in that language. I think it's the ways that we can take out time in a way that hopefully enhances our career, decreases burnout, because hopefully there will be, both a return in terms of their quality of care, but also your personal and in a virtue ethics kind of frame, like your personal abilities as someone who can provide that kind of lending of power in a way that engages the other. So that's sort of my answer.
It's a beautiful answer. And so we're just about at the end of time. And so what I'd like to do is, if it's okay, is Zamina, I'll leave that as your last word. I'll give Anita just a moment, if that's okay, Anita, to add anything else that you'd like to round out the conversation. And actually, no, that's not fair. I'll ask Anita for a last word. I'll ask Zamina for a very last word, and then we'll wrap up, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, maybe just a very brief point to add to what Zamina was saying. I think sometimes when we are under time constraint and that we think that how can we do all of the above, right? But something that sometimes actually can really save us more time is that if we just treat this individual in front of us as a person that we don't know enough about yet, if we put aside our assumptions and presumptions and ask the patient, what's most important to you right now? What do you need? Who should we talk with? That actually can often help to save us much more time later on. And so sometimes we think that there may be a lot of things we need to do, but if we treat the person at a human level and put aside our assumptions and have that humility, that may actually give us more answers.
Thank you for that. Zamina, did you have a last word you wanted to say before we leave?
I think that, yeah, I would agree with Dr. Ho. And the most important thing is asking what matters most. And to ask that question, I know seems like common sense. It seems very, like it makes sense to us, but I think we'd all be surprised at how, when we're worried again about sort of the things that we have to deliver and produce in order to keep within our professions and do the work that we need to do on an ongoing basis, how many of the stories often slip by and how we use hacks and heuristics and biases to fill in parts of the narrative that actually genuinely haven't been filled in by the patient themselves. So I would encourage folks to always be mindful of the categorizations and labels that they put as an act of power, to be mindful of language and use it carefully, even if it's with other colleagues, not in front of the patient, or even if it's in other spaces, to think about, why am I using this language now? Why this language with this person in this place right now? To situate yourself and ask yourself at any given point, is something being misplaced? And even if something isn't being misplaced, ensuring that it hasn't been, by taking the time with the people that you are responsible for, even within a research ethics position or a policy making position. And then I think last, like doing what we can to practice that humility, and maybe it means less papers, or maybe it means less accolades for ourselves, but giving that power is, I think, the highest form of ethical work that you can do, and listening is the best form. And I think it'll be something that comes and reverberates back in the bioethics community as we create a kind of community that represents the people we serve.
Thank you so much. Well, that was terrific. Thank you both very much for your time and for your contribution to the society to help us think about this in a more deep kind of way. At this point, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to give it to Moji. But before I do, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to the many, many people who are involved in making this happen. The interpreters, Andrew Ross, our wonderful technical support person behind the scenes, who does a fantastic, thankless, quiet job behind the scenes. The organizing committee, Moji, Daniel Buckman, Victoria Siebel-Klein, Catherine Duthie, and others on the board who are doing a fantastic job. So just wanted to say thank you very, very much for this opportunity. And Moji, with that, I'm pleased to turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Bashir. Yeah.
I'm so sorry, and I wanted to say thank you for all the great questions and comments. My apologies that we didn't get to them all. The speakers do have them all, but thank you for the participation of the members as well. So I'm sorry, Moji.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bashir, for that great job today. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, please fill out our survey where you can share your thoughts about this session and suggest topics for future sessions. We look forward to seeing you in our next series of conversations in Canadian bioethics in 2023. Bye.